This lecture will be on exhibits. So a big part of this class, of course, is producing an exhibit. And this lecture is going to focus on the actual production of an exhibit, but also is going to talk about a few things about evaluating exhibits and things like that. And I do want to point out, before I taught this class as an online course, as an experiment, I taught it as a directed independent study. And I just want to show you a couple pictures of people who made exhibits so you can kind of see what they looked like. This is Deontay Belton. He made a very good exhibit on looking at the Black Panthers and their charitable work, and I thought that came out pretty well. And this is Becca Watford, who did her project on children and their games in history, and that also, I think, came out pretty well. This is when I taught the class. This DIS was taught in person, so they actually had to present their exhibits to the entire class. And Becca made some historic food as part of our part of her exhibit and shared it with us. That's why there's plates out there. But we had a good time, and I just want to kind of give you an example of what some of our students' exhibits looked like, and give you an idea of what you could do. So what you saw there were pretty standard exhibits. But there's other ways you can get really creative. I think the exhibits that those two students did were fine, were good, with that kind of standard three-folding display. But here's a couple examples from the National History Day that might be of some interest. National History Day is something for like middle school, high school students, but they do some really cool stuff. The person on the left did a history of Barbie, and you can see that they made their exhibit look like one of Barbie's houses. And they use that as a way to kind of talk about who Barbie was, right? And then on the right, someone is looking at McDonald's and their kind of history, and their how it has the food has changed people's lifestyles. Now you have to be careful, because both these could very easily veer into kind of current events, but we're looking at history. But as long as they're careful, they could stay history. But the key thing I want to highlight is just how clever they are, right? The McDonald's exhibit looks like a box of fries, right? The Barbie exhibit looks like a Barbie's dream house. So you can be really creative here if you want when you're doing your exhibit assignment. But you can also just do kind of a standard one. And one thing I want to point out, a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you today is just taken straight from the National History Day requirements. The Wisconsin History Day, and that's not a separate event. It is the same History Day. It's just the Wisconsin group. They have awesome stuff. If you look them up on Google, the Wisconsin History Day, they do great stuff. A lot of their images I'm going to use in this PowerPoint. So you can see there it says W History at just below the Barbie house. That's the Wisconsin History Day logo. And so wherever you see that, that's something I borrowed directly from them. And they did great stuff, and I'm using it. And I just wanted to let you. But I do want to give credit where credit is due. Now, whenever you have an exhibit, you have to have an idea. Right, you have to have a big idea that you're going to be talking about, and that's true for any museum, but it's also true for your exhibit. You have to think, okay, what is this going to be about? Right, and that's fairly general. I'm interested in the mills in Greenwood. I'm interested in children's toys, something like that. That's kind of your big idea, right? And once you get your big idea, you need to do research on it, right? You need to use a variety of primary and secondary sources. And based on that, you develop a thesis statement. You're going to make an argument. Sometimes I hear people when they're going to give a presentation and they get up and say, my paper is about the Industrial Revolution. That's just not a good way to begin something. That's not going to get people interested. Remember, when you work at a museum, it's free choice learning. If you don't pull people in with your exhibit title, they're not going to look at it. They're not going to spend much time. So you need to have a clear idea of what you're doing, and you need to make a clear point. So they're going to sit back and say, huh, that's an interesting idea. So you need a big idea, but then you're going to say something about that idea. You're going to make an argument, and I'm going to talk more about that. And you need to think about how your exhibit is going to make that argument, how you're going to present evidence that makes your argument make sense. And this is where public historians and academic historians are very similar. We're making arguments and we're using evidence to support our arguments. We just do it in different ways, right? A museum curator does it through the exhibits. I do it through a paper. Now here it says you need to annotate a bibliography with your exhibit. You don't need to do that for this class, but there are assignments later that require you to show me the primary and secondary sources you're using, and I do expect that your exhibit will show that you have done some research and some thinking about it. Otherwise, you're going to lose points on it. but you need to start with research. You got to learn something before you can teach other people. And I'm amazed at how people will try and teach without knowing anything. And you probably have had teachers who don't really know what they're talking about and try and teach. You can't do that. You got to know stuff to teach stuff. Your thesis statement then, right? You're going to need a thesis statement in addition to a big idea. It should contain three things: a clear subject, an action verb, and why it's important. So what? Right? So what? Why bother with this? And to give you an example, this is one I just came up with. The post-World War I development of cotton mills created a new era of prosperity in Greenwood. And that thesis statement says several things that are important. And it has a clear subject: cotton mills. Right. And I'm talking, and I make it clear what cotton mills, right? It's specific. The post-World War I development of cotton mills. I'm talking about the period from like 1918 to like 1929. So I've given a clear era, a clear time period, and I have a clear subject, right? By reading the thesis statement, what I'm going to be talking about. And then I have an action verb: created. So I have a clear subject, and that subject did something. And so what? They created a new era of prosperity in Greenwood. So this is the historical interest. They made a time when our town was doing well, when it was becoming wealthier, right? So there I have the clear subject, an action verb, and then the so what. And if you can't do that, you don't have a good thesis statement. You've got to have those things if you want to have a clear thesis statement. And that's something people often struggle with. And the reason they struggle with it is because they don't really know their subject. So you have to have a big idea of what you want to do. Then you have to have do some research so you understand it. And then you can have a thesis statement. But you can't do that unless you know something. And one thing I also want to point out, thesis statements have to be arguable. Someone could disagree with this statement. Someone could say, no, the mills were bad for Greenwood. They made people poor because they didn't pay good wages or something like that. I'm not saying that's what happened. But the key thing is you could argue with this statement, right? You can't have a thesis statement that is boring, that doesn't say anything. You can't have a thesis statement: the Industrial Revolution led to an increase in production. I mean, okay, yeah, we know that. You can't argue with that. We know that for a fact. It has to be something you can argue with, and it has to be clear. Now, if you were going to write a paper, when you organize it, you have to, you make an outline. But remember, this is a little bit different, right? This is visual. So you need to think about sections. And for your assignment, you have different sections you have to make for your museum assignment. So typically you need to have, for example, background, giving information. You have to have a thesis, and then you have the importance. And you should, each of these has to go back to your thesis. If my thesis is about Greenwood mills, I shouldn't say anything really about mills, say, in the Northeast necessarily, or I shouldn't say something about non-mills, other forms of factory, right? I need to stay focused. So each section should be directly connected to supporting what I just said. And here they also had the statement: organize those sections in a logical way. So for example, they have the background. Notice, in the West, in English, we read from left to right. So you have the background on the left side because that's where people are probably going to start, right? The thesis is in the middle, but it's big. So people will actually probably go there first, and then they'll start with the background. And then the impact, the kind of conclusion, is on the right. So it's logical. People are going to read in that direction. They don't necessarily, usually we read left to right, but we'll often go biggest to smallest too. So, you're attracted to that thesis in the middle, then you go over to the background, come back to the middle, then go to the right. So let's have a closer look. This person did a presentation on Jack the Ripper. And you can see they have a really good title up there. It says Jack the Ripper, Media's Perpetual Sensation and Notorious Catalyst of Social Reform. So I know from the beginning, this is about Jack the Ripper. But I know that it's not just a general thing about Jack the Ripper. It's going to be looking at media coverage and how that led to social reform. So right away, it's got my attention. I want to go in and look at that. And notice I said I want to go in. Whoever made this, I think purposely made it more closed, right? They added that title at the top, which kind of holds the folds together. And you may say, hey, that's not a particularly good exhibit. It's hard to see. I think the reason the person did that, it's supposed to be like an alley or a very narrow street, right? Jack the Ripper was active in the East End of London with all these narrow streets and alleys where he could sneak up on people and attack them and then escape very quickly. I think that's what that exhibit is meant to evoke. is that feeling. And that's neat that they would do it that way. But so the title brings you in, and notice how just below the title is the thesis statement. It's kind of on its own in the center, right? There's not other things that are going to really distract you from it. Though there is a repetition of the title at the bottom, but the idea is that that's kind of text on its own. It's going to attract your attention. You're going to go up and read the thesis statement, and then you'll probably move your eyes to the left, and you'll see these different subheadings that below them have different images, illustrations, and documents proving the point. There's captions that explain these. So this is a very, very good exhibit in terms of organization. And I would highly encourage you to try and follow this as much as possible. Notice they also praised it because they said smart color choices, red and black. That's great for Jack the Ripper, right? He's operating at night. It's dark. There's blood. It's red. Good font selection. The fonts bring you in. They are evocative of a different time period, but you can still read them. Again, the organization is strong here. And this person did include their anti-bibliography and process paper, though that's not necessary for this class. And here we'll look a little bit closer. Here's another example of this kind of exhibit. And they point out here, this is about Susan Anthony, and it says Equal Education for Women, a little-known legacy of Susan B. Anthony. Right? So again, title is very clear what it's about. You can see the thesis statement just below it. But your eye, like it says here, is going to look at the title first. It's the largest text. It's going to draw you in. And then logically, you're probably going to go back down to that next thing down there, the thesis statement. Notice it's a smaller font size in the title, but still slightly larger than the other text. So that way you know, oh, this is the next most important thing. I'm going to look at that. And notice they have a nice picture of Susan B. Anthony next to it, so you can have her in your mind as you continue to read and look at this exhibit. And then it's noted that here it says the rest of the exhibit is divided into sections that support the argument these students are making about Susan B. Anthony's role in education. Right? So it says background. It's just going to tell you a little bit about who Susan B. Anthony is. Lower left, it says actions for equal pay. Right? And you can see some nice pictures, some nice text. Notice that they don't just stick the picture on there. They got a background to the picture. That looks nice. On the upper right, it says actions for a co-education. Right? So those are two subjects that are slightly different. One is for equal pay, one is for co-education, but they go back to her arguments about education. And then in the bottom there, it says legacy, right? It's giving you that kind of sense of a conclusion. So this is a story. It's telling you a story. Story's over. And just as kind of review here, right, your thesis should stand out. Just like when I'm reading a paper, I want to be able to clearly identify the thesis. You need to do that in your museum exhibit. And this isn't just for you. This is any kind of museum exhibit. It's the most important thing on your exhibit because it tells us what the story is going to be about. It tells us your argument. And you should not, it says here you don't need to label it. I think it's bad to label a thesis. I mean, we should know. That's what I mean. It's not good when a student says, my paper is about. Tell us what it's about. Don't say my paper is about. Catch us. You know, we only have so much time and energy. You really want to catch us and make us want to learn more. And as I said here, you know, you need to use other things. You need to use the font size, the placement, and design elements to help it stand out. And this is one reason, by the way, I think it's important to teach a public history course because people like me, I'm comfortable writing. That's what I like to do. I like to read and write. And I like history, so it makes sense I would read and write about history. But you may like history and not particularly like writing 30-page papers, which is usually what I do. You may feel more comfortable working with images and captions and color and things like that. And that's what's cool about working at a museum is you get to do that. And these are just further examples that show a clear thesis statement, so you can easily find out where it is and what it's doing. It's interesting, notice on the right, and this makes sense because they're looking at airplanes, the thesis statement is kind of like descending from the sky, which is pretty cool. And so you can see how these students aren't just saying, this is my thesis statement. They're using the color and their design and things that will attract your eye. And keep in mind that people usually read the biggest font to the smallest font. They may start in the center, but they're going to go left then, and then they're going to go right after that. So it's keeping those kind of rules about how human beings, at least in the West, typically read. I say in the West because some cultures will read left to right. Now, you also, you start with your text typically, though sometimes you could start with your images. It depends on what you're doing. But you need to identify your supporting materials. What images, illustrations, documents, or other media can you incorporate? And the key thing is that each item should have a direct connection to the argument you are making. I'm sure you've seen like a PowerPoint presentation where someone spent a huge amount of time putting up all these beautiful images, but they don't talk about them. and it's not even clear how those images are connected to their presentation. And the feeling is, well, this just isn't a good presentation, right? Why did you use these images and then not say anything about them or connect them, right? So there's a good chance, and I like this, narrow it down. You will probably have found much more than you can put on your exhibit. Focus on those materials that make your thesis statement. I know it's frustrating to cut out things or to leave out things that are really cool, but again, you want to keep your audience in mind. It's, in a sense, making a good exhibit. It's not simply about you. It's what your audience is going to enjoy and be interested in. And if there's extra materials, do you make another exhibit later? And here's just some further examples of the kind of images you can do, right? Photographs, those let the viewer really see these things, see these people. A map gives you a sense of what sort of people you're talking about and where. Quotes or passages from interviews, those give evidence. That's why I require that you include some primary sources. And like this, newspaper headlines provide additional information. Get those in there, right? They look cool. They add to the immersion of the project, and they look really good. And notice, I mean, this one's getting kind of borderline, but you want to make sure that things don't get too busy. Sometimes things are so busy, and this is why we had this emphasis on you don't have to include everything, only what's relevant. If it gets too busy, you feel overwhelmed and you don't want to keep reading. And in my opinion, this is a cool exhibit, but I almost think this is too much text, and there's just too much stuff jammed in there. But you do want to keep in mind pictures, maps, quotes, headlines. These are all great things to include in your exhibit. Now, I think this is kind of an interesting exhibit. It says here, instead of just including these 3 political cartoons on our exhibit, the student also included an interpretive caption. And I think this is good, right? Pictures are not necessarily things that people will understand. You bring a certain context when you look at a picture or when you look at an image, right? And so you may look at these and not get it. And so it's important that you want to kind of make these things clear or give people a clue about how they should interpret them. So that's what that person has done. And they've made it very clear. They have 3 arrows pointing from this caption that explains what these could mean and gives you a clue on how to read these. Right? And the text in that box is kind of repeated here. These 3 political cartoons illustrate the conflict between workers and their employers. If we look at how the inspector is portrayed, we see that the artist was sympathetic to the workers and believed that the lack of regulation contributed to the deaths. So you can kind of see that this person is helping the reader to understand this, and they do this in a way that's not patronizing, but and it refers clearly to those cartoons to help them understand. Now, this is, I think, up to personal taste. To me, again, this is too busy. I think there's too many images in the back there, and I think that's distracting. But some people may think, no, this is cool, and that's something you have to decide when you make an exhibit. This is an example of how you can use fonts cleverly, right? The innovation of the sewing machine, right? That kind of looks like 19th century font. Like on the right, extravaganza, the audacious action and lavish legacies of John Ringling, circus tycoon, right? So it's about the circus, and that's very appropriate there. And undercover behind the gates of hell, you can guess that, and you can see the swastikas. That's clearly about, I think it's going to be about the Holocaust and about the extermination camps. Right, but there you can all these things evoke the feel of a particular time. There's this history of the Old West. You know, they're using fonts carefully, and these are things to think about. Now, again, I want to stress, you don't, like I said, there's people who will spend all this time finding cool pictures but won't connect them. You don't want to spend too much time getting just the right font, right? Remember, the big emphasis is on the content. And so just as kind of a reminder when you're dealing with fonts, remember, I like this from the Wisconsin history. Remember the hierarchy. Varying the size of your font helps viewers to go from the big ideas to supporting evidence. Titles should be biggest. Section headers can be a little smaller. Text in the body of your exhibit should be smaller yet. Right? That will help guide their eyes and help them to engage seamlessly without having to think too much. They're just going to be sucked in to your exhibit, and they'll be able to follow it naturally and understand what you're saying. Like I said, you had this big idea. You have to make it into a title. Like I said, make it snazzy, but also has to describe your topic. And they give some great examples here. You could just call it Susan B. Anthony or Votes for Women, Susan B. Anthony in the Fight for Suffrage. Agriculture in the 20th century, that's pretty boring. Adapt or Die, the impact of revolutionary changes in agriculture in the 20th century. That's pretty cool. Louis Pasteur, not so exciting. Or Pasteurization, the concept that changed the way you look at milk. Right? All clear examples of how you can make a kind of snazzy title. So there's some things that you would normally need in your exhibit as well that we're not going to require for your museum exhibit, right? That's meant to kind of give you some basic understandings of the principles behind putting together a museum exhibit. And I don't require that you do everything that would maybe be part of a normal museum exhibit, but I still need to mention that so you can just know and kind of think about these things. So one thing typically is that they will often have a list of credits of all the people who helped with an exhibition, right? Your exhibit you're mostly doing on your own, but other exhibits are the product of many people. So if you look at this exhibit credits that they would have displayed prominently in the exhibit, it lists the consultants who helped make it, it lists the co-sponsors who helped support it, it lists the photographer, it lists the technical development support people. It's got to, you got to give credit to these people because they helped out. And a lot of these people are probably working for free. My guess is that the exhibition consultants, notice they're all professors. They're probably people who work at the university and who were willing to take time to help out the museum and probably were not paid extra for doing so. So you want to give them credit and thanks, because if you don't, why would they continue to help you? Right? And this is key, because you may say, well, geez, why would people be so strict? Well, first of all, that's just human. We want people to give us credit. But the problem is, if you don't give them credit, it makes it look like you did everything. So you're stealing their credit, right? If four of us come up with an idea and work together, but I make it sound like it was just me and I don't give credit to the other three people, they're going to be upset with me and say, hey, you're trying to steal our credit. So it's very important. In addition, they give credit typically for sources. So sometimes if you display a photograph, you need to explain where that photograph came from. Especially, or if you have a document that you use from an archives, you need to give credit to that archive. So, and that's something that they're going to tell you more about if you were to be in a public history master's program. But I just want to highlight that just like, you often have to have a bibliography and footnotes in a paper, you do similar things in a museum exhibit. If you did fundraising and you ask for donations, you also want to give those people credit. And a lot of times you'll notice if you go into a museum, they'll have like a list of names, and oftentimes they're kind of ranked. Like they'll be like gold level, platinum level, bronze level, silver level, something like that. And that is to recognize the people who gave money. And if you don't recognize them, they're not going to give you money anymore. And it's something you have to really emphasize. It's very important to recognize the stakeholders, all the people who came together to make the exhibit. Exhibits usually aren't just one person, and entire communities can be involved, and you have to give them recognition. If you don't, they're not going to help you in the future, and your museum will not be able to continue its mission, or maybe even continue to exist. And it's very important to build relationships with those people, to stay in touch, and to thank them. And I have to tell you, I have been connected in the past to various institutions and have not maintained my connection because they failed in these areas where they, I would help out, they wouldn't give me credit, but they'd still want me to help out. And it's like, hey, I've got other work to do, and you're not going to give me credit, you're not going to recognize me. I'm going to use my time to work with someone who will recognize me. And I'm not saying that to be bitter or spiteful, but people only have so much time. And if you aren't recognizing them, they're going to spend their time and money on someone who will. So you really want to focus on that. And in particular, I want to emphasize, this is why I'm strict about like people answering their emails, because it's really frustrating. If you donate someone money and you have questions, they need to email you back, right? That's something to kind of keep in mind. If you don't, they won't continue to give you money. Now, one other thing that's important to think about is how museum exhibits are evaluated, right? In this class, you're evaluated by a grade. I give you a grade based on your exhibit. And that's something that's how this works, because this is a class. But for museums, there's different types of evaluations that are conducted at different times. And these are very, very, very important, because if you evaluate at the right time, you can avoid unneeded expense or controversy. Right. So let me give you an example. There's what is often called a front end evaluation. And this is kind of when you're at the big idea stage, when you're just generally thinking about, wouldn't it be cool if we did an exhibit on the Greenwood Mills? Or wouldn't it be cool if we did 1918 is I'm making this in 1918. Wouldn't it be cool if we made a special exhibit on the centenary of the end of World War I? Wouldn't that be cool? Why not do that? And you would maybe have in front-end evaluation, you get together with a group of people, including your stakeholders. These could be people, community leaders, volunteers, people like that. And you say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? And they would give you ideas, and they would say, well, maybe that's inappropriate to do in this time period, or maybe, we could do it, but let's do it this way, because if we do it this way, this group will support us, right? So that's kind of the beginning. Then before you, based on those ideas, you start making an exhibit. But when you're mostly done with the exhibit, but not completely done, when you've kind of got things into a good shape, and I shouldn't say completely done, but when you got a good amount of stuff done, then you can do what's called a formative evaluation, and that's where you would maybe bring in, again, people from the community, historians, someone to just have a look at how things are progressing, just to make sure that things are okay, because they may say, oh, wait a second, we really shouldn't talk about that person because, there's some secret past about them, and it will come out, and that will cause a huge controversy, and now's not the time for that, or something like that, right? They may say, hey, we got to hold off. Or, you know what, if you do that, you're going to make these people upset because of this situation here. It's very easy to have controversy. And so they may say, maybe we should shift it this way. And the problem is you want to figure that stuff out before the exhibit opens, because once it's opened, wow, it can be a huge problem. We're going to deal with more of these things in the controversy section. Once the exhibit is open, you often do what's called a remedial evaluation. And this is when you would go through the exhibit to see if there's any problems with the exhibit. So for example, you may find, you know what, we made the fonts too small, or we use this font, it's not working right, or hey, the video's not looping correctly. So once you open the exhibit, you do these remedial evaluations just to make sure it's working smoothly. Right. And, here they have this question, how did this show change your view of battle aboard the USS Constitution? And you may find, well, wait a second, people are posting this information. It's not making their view more historically accurate. It's actually making it historically inaccurate. So we need to fix this, right? That's an example of remedial evaluation, figuring out what's going on with a exhibit that is underway and make sure it's running as smoothly as possible. Once the exhibit is over, you would go through a summative evaluation where you ask yourself, okay, these are the things that worked. These are the things that need improvement. And how can we apply this for next time we host this exhibit, or if we make another exhibit, right? We may say, hey, you know what? We didn't have enough volunteers. Let's make sure we have more volunteers, and let's strategize how we can increase the number of volunteers. That's the kind of thing you would do in a summative evaluation. But it's key that you're always developing, you're always learning. And one thing we have to stress, the audience is always changing. New people are going to be coming to museums. So you always have to be evaluating and making sure that you're reaching their audience, because in the end, a large part of how you continue to exist as a museum is helping that audience to better understand history in an enjoyable and productive way.